Skies of Fire. Chapter 3. Oxford Days. Morning arrived with the deep, resonant tones of Great Tom, the bell in Christchurch's tower, striking 7. The sound penetrated stone walls and leaded windows, rousing me from a sleep deeper than any I'd experienced since leaving America. I blinked at the unfamiliar ceiling, ancient oak beams running in parallel lines across whitewashed plaster, and for a moment forgot where I was. "Rise and shine, gentleman aviator," Cal called from across the room. Already dressed, he stood by the window, the weak October sunlight casting his tall frame in silhouette. First day of British education begins in precisely 1 hour. I sat up, running a hand through my hair. Springs and Stokes were also awake, moving about our shared quarters with the practiced efficiency of men accustomed to military schedules. Outside, I could hear similar activity in the corridor. Water running, doors opening and closing, voices calling back and forth as 150 American cadets prepared for their first day of training at Oxford. "Sleep well?" Springs asked, lacing his boots with quick, precise movements. "Like the dead," I admitted. "Something about these old walls." Stokes nodded agreement. "They've seen a lot worse than us come and go." After washing up with the limited hot water available, I joined the others for the walk to the mess hall. The morning air carried a damp chill that penetrated our uniforms. A reminder that English autumn was very different from what we would have experienced in Italy. The mess hall, or hall, as we'd been corrected by a local student, buzzed with activity. Breakfast was a surprisingly substantial affair. Eggs, bacon, toast, and tea served on heavy china plates bearing the college crest. We found seats at one of the long tables, joining Bird, Kelly, Curtis, and McCurry, who had already begun eating. "Not bad," Bird admitted around a mouthful of toast. "Better than ship's fare, that's for sure." "Enjoy it while it lasts," Curtis cautioned. One of the British cadets told me food rationing gets stricter every month. Sugar's already scarce, and meat's heading that way. Springs buttered his toast with meticulous care. 3 years of war will do that. Supply lines stretched thin, U-boats sinking cargo ships, agricultural labor diverted to fighting. "Thanks for the economics lesson, Professor," Kelly quipped. "Some of us are trying to enjoy breakfast." Before Springs could respond, a bell rang, signaling the end of the meal period. We finished quickly and filed out into the quadrangle, where British officers waited to escort us to our first classes. We were divided into groups based on our previous training. Those with mechanical experience assigned to one track, those with mathematical backgrounds to another, and so on. Cal, Springs, and I found ourselves in the same group, headed for a classroom in one of the college's ancient buildings. Inside, desks had been arranged in neat rows facing a blackboard. The walls were lined with diagrams of aircraft engines, cutaway views of machine guns, maps of European air sectors, marked with colored pins indicating Allied and German positions. Our instructor arrived precisely at 8. A British captain with the distinctive wings of the Royal Flying Corps on his uniform. He was younger than I'd expected, perhaps 25, with a thin mustache and the faded eyes of a man who has seen too much in too short a time. "Gentlemen," he began without preamble, "I am Captain Westfield. For the next 4 weeks, I will be teaching you everything you need to know about aerial combat tactics, and more importantly, everything you need to unlearn from your American training." A murmur of discontent rippled through the room. quickly silenced by the captain's raised eyebrow. "This is not a reflection on your instructors back home," he continued in a tone suggesting it was precisely that, but rather an acknowledgement that aerial warfare evolves week by week. What was accepted practice 6 months ago may now be considered suicide. My job is to ensure you have the most current knowledge before you face the Hun in the air. He turned to the blackboard and began sketching aircraft profiles with quick, confident strokes. The German Air Service currently employs several main types of combat aircraft. You will learn to identify each from any angle, at any altitude, in any weather condition. Your life will depend on this knowledge. And so our Oxford education began, intense, comprehensive, and distinctly British in its approach. Captain Westfield proved to be a demanding instructor, interrupting his lectures to fire questions at random cadets, expecting immediate and correct responses. Those who hesitated or erred received withering critiques delivered in the precise, cutting manner that seemed uniquely English. "Mr. Marshall," he called during our second hour, "you observe a biplane at 3,000 feet, approaching from the northeast. The upper wing is noticeably longer than the lower, and the fuselage appears stepped. Identification?" I hesitated only briefly. "Albatross D3, sir." "Correct. And your appropriate response?" "Depends on my aircraft and position, sir." Captain Westfield's mustache twitched in what might have been approval. "Elaborate." "In an SE-5, I'd climb to gain altitude advantage, then attack from above and behind if possible. In a Sopwith, I'd use superior maneuverability to avoid the initial pass, then try to get on his tail in a turning fight." "Not entirely wrong," the captain conceded, which seemed to be his highest form of praise. "Though you've overlooked the possibility of additional enemy aircraft. The Hun rarely flies alone these days." The morning passed in a blur of technical information: aircraft identification, engine specifications, combat tactics, patrol formations. By lunchtime, my hand ached from taking notes, and my brain felt stuffed with details that somehow had to be memorized before tomorrow's session. "Well," Cal said as we walked back to the mess hall, "they certainly don't believe in easing us in gently." Springs nodded, reviewing his notebook. "They can't afford to. Every day they spend training us is another day we're not at the front." The afternoon brought a different kind of instruction: physical training on the college's playing fields, led by a sergeant whose vocabulary seemed limited to variations of faster and harder. After 3 hours of running, climbing, wrestling, and calisthenics, we staggered back to our quarters, muscles burning and lungs raw in the cool air. "This," gasped Bird, collapsing onto his bed in the room next to ours, "is not what I signed up for. I want to fly planes, not run laps until I puke." "Pilot fitness," Springs reminded him without sympathy. "What happens if you're wounded in the air? You'll need every ounce of strength to bring your plane home." Bird groaned and covered his face with a pillow. "Right now, I'd settle for enough strength to make it to dinner." Somehow, we all managed to recover sufficiently for the evening meal, drawn by hunger and the prospect of more of that excellent 1904 vintage champagne. The hall buzzed with conversation as cadets compared notes on their first day of training, sharing impressions of instructors and commiserating over the physical demands. "Did you get Westfield?" Curtis asked, joining us at our table. I nodded. "Aircraft identification and combat tactics." "Lucky. We got some major who spent 3 hours explaining the difference between English and American machine gun ammunition. man could put a caffeinated squirrel to sleep. The food arrived. Simple but substantial fare that reflected wartime rationing. Roast beef with gravy, potatoes, carrots, and bread pudding for dessert. What luxuries remained in England seemed to be reserved for those about to risk their lives in combat, a fact not lost on any of us. After dinner, we faced another reality of wartime England: mandatory blackout. As darkness fell, heavy curtains were drawn across every window. Doors were carefully sealed against light leakage, and outside movement was restricted. Cal, Springs, and I found ourselves in a small group that ventured into Oxford proper that evening, guided by one of the British cadets who knew which establishments remained open despite wartime restrictions. The city streets were eerily dark, pedestrians moving like ghosts in the gloom, occasionally illuminated by the shielded beam of a military vehicle's headlamp. The Canton Bar, our destination, proved to be a low-ceilinged pub down a narrow alley. Inside, the atmosphere was smoky and warm. A piano played in one corner, the tinny notes almost drowned by conversation and laughter. "First round's on me," Cal announced, making his way to the bar, where a middle-aged woman with remarkably red hair presided over the taps. He returned minutes later with 4 pints of dark liquid that might have been brown or black in proper light. "What is it?" I asked, accepting a glass. "Bitter," our British guide informed me. "Proper English ale. None of that American piss water." I took a cautious sip and found it unexpectedly complex. Bitter indeed, but with undertones of chocolate and coffee, served at room temperature rather than chilled. Different from anything I'd drunk back home, but not unpleasant. "Well?" Cal asked, watching my reaction. "I could get used to it," I admitted. The evening unfolded in a pleasant haze of conversation and drink. Our British guide, a cadet named Forsyth, proved to be an excellent raconteur, entertaining us with stories of Oxford traditions and history. Locals drifted in and out of our circle, curious about the Americans, now stationed in their ancient university town. "You lot are bloody lucky," one elderly gentleman informed us, his accent thickened by alcohol. "Most of our boys went straight from school to trenches. No college education for them." "We're not exactly here for the classical education," Springs pointed out diplomatically. "Just passing through on our way to the front." The old man squinted at him. "Flying, eh? Rather you than me, lad. Rather you than me." His sentiment echoed what we'd encountered throughout Oxford. A curious mixture of respect and pity from civilians who had watched too many young men disappear into the machinery of war. 3 years into the conflict, British society had adjusted to constant loss, developing a stoicism that masked deeper emotions. Later, as we walked back to Christ Church through the blackout, Forsyth elaborated on this theme. "You'll notice most people don't talk about the war directly," he observed. "Bad form to dwell on it, you see. But it's always there, just beneath the surface." "Like a wound that won't heal," Springs suggested. Forsyth nodded. "Good analogy. We've all lost someone. Brothers, fathers, friends. My own brother went down over the Somme last year. Sopwith pup against 3 Albatross scouts. No chance, really." His matter-of-fact tone belied the personal tragedy, demonstrating exactly the British restraint he'd described. I found myself wondering if we Americans would develop similar coping mechanisms once our own casualties mounted, or if we would remain the emotional, expressive people we'd always been. Days passed, establishing a routine of intense study and physical training. Each morning brought new technical information to absorb: engine mechanics, weather patterns, aircraft limitations, signal protocols. Afternoons were devoted to physical conditioning and practical exercises, including disassembling and reassembling machine guns while blindfolded. The Vickers will jam at the worst possible moment, our weapons instructor warned. Usually when a Fokker is on your tail. You'll need to clear it without looking, with freezing hands, while maneuvering to avoid being shot down. So, practice until your fingers bleed, gentlemen. Then, practice more. Evenings offered limited leisure time, which most of us spent exploring Oxford or recovering in our quarters. The city revealed itself gradually. Ancient colleges and chapels, riverside paths where students had walked for centuries, pubs and tea shops where locals viewed us with cautious curiosity. One such evening, about a week into our stay, Cal, Springs, and I found ourselves in a tea shop on the high street, having been invited by a group of female students we'd met earlier that day. The women were studying at Lady Margaret Hall, one of the few Oxford colleges that accepted female students, and were pursuing subjects ranging from literature to mathematics. "How strange it must be for you," one of them, Elizabeth, a serious brunette studying classics, remarked, "to find yourselves at Oxford instead of in combat." "Unexpected," Springs acknowledged, stirring his tea, "but not unwelcome. Oxford seems a pleasant place to prepare for war." Another student, Mary, blonde and outspoken, leaned forward. "Is that how you see it? As preparation?" "What else would it be?" Cal asked. Mary shrugged. "Education is traditionally seen as an end in itself here, the pursuit of knowledge for knowledge's sake." "Luxury of peacetime," I found myself saying. "Right now, knowledge is just another weapon." A silence followed my comment, the cultural divide suddenly more apparent. These women lived in a world where academic pursuits retained their pre-war significance, despite the conflict raging across the Channel. We inhabited a different reality, where everything, even Oxford's ancient traditions, had been repurposed for war. "You mustn't think us frivolous," Elizabeth said after a moment. "We're doing our part as well. Most of us volunteer at the hospitals when we're not studying, and many of our male classmates are already gone, enlisted or conscripted." Springs nodded. "No one questions your contribution. We're just coming from different perspectives." The conversation moved to lighter topics: comparisons between American and English universities, discussions of books and music, debates about post-war society. For a few hours, we existed in a space where the war seemed distant, where we were simply young people enjoying each other's company. Walking back to Christ Church later, Cal nudged my shoulder. "Elizabeth seemed quite taken with you." I shook my head. "Just being polite. English manners and all that." "No, he's right," Springs confirmed. "She kept watching you when you weren't looking. Very proper about it, but definitely interested." The observation caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on training, on the mechanics of becoming a pilot, that I'd barely considered other aspects of life in England. "Maybe I'll see her again before we leave," I said noncommittally. Springs chuckled. "That's the spirit. Live a little before they send us up to die in flaming coffins." "Your optimism is inspiring," Cal remarked dryly. "Just being realistic," Springs replied. "Half the men in our training group won't see 1919. Might as well enjoy the time we have." His blunt assessment wasn't wrong, but it cast a shadow over the pleasant evening. We walked the rest of the way in silence, each lost in private thoughts about mortality and what we might accomplish in whatever time remained to us. As October gave way to November, our training intensified. Theoretical knowledge was increasingly supplemented by practical exercises. Map reading in actual terrain, signal practice with flares and lamps, survival drills in the countryside, surrounding Oxford. The physical regimen grew more demanding, designed to prepare us for the physical stress of flying primitive aircraft in combat conditions. Your body will be your worst enemy up there, Captain Westfield informed us during one particularly grueling session. Cold that penetrates to your bones, G-forces that drain the blood from your brain, oxygen deprivation at altitude. You must learn to function despite your body's protests. We pushed ourselves and each other, aware that our lives would soon depend on this training. Friendships deepened through shared hardship, creating bonds stronger than many of us had experienced in civilian life. We learned each other's strengths and weaknesses, developing the instinctive understanding that would be crucial in aerial formations, where communication was limited to hand signals and aircraft movements. The British cadets training alongside us became companions as well, their initial reserve gradually giving way to cautious camaraderie. They were younger than most of us, many barely 18, but possessed a world-weary maturity born of growing up in a nation at war. They shared knowledge freely, particularly the unofficial wisdom not found in training manuals. Never fly straight and level for more than 20 seconds, advised a British cadet named Wilson. That's how long it takes a decent Archie gunner to range you. Archie? Bird asked. Anti-aircraft fire. Keep moving, keep changing altitude, and you might live long enough to worry about enemy aircraft. Such practical advice, delivered matter-of-factly by boys who looked too young to shave, drove home the reality of what awaited us. These weren't academic exercises or theoretical scenarios. They were survival tactics developed through bitter experience. In the third week of November, Major McDill returned from Paris, his mission to clarify our orders apparently complete. We assembled in the hall to hear his report, curious about our eventual destination. Gentlemen, he began, standing before us in the historic space, I've spent the past weeks in consultation with American and Allied command. The situation has been complicated. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Our original orders to proceed to Italy were indeed authentic. However, circumstances have changed. The Italian front has experienced significant setbacks in recent weeks, and the immediate need for pilots has shifted to the Western Front. This was news to us. Isolated in our Oxford training bubble, we'd had limited access to current events. The Major continued, explaining that we would complete our ground training at Oxford, then proceed to actual flight training at various Royal Flying Corps airfields throughout England. Once you have earned your wings, he concluded, you will be assigned according to operational needs. Some of you may indeed go to Italy eventually. Others will join squadrons in France. The war is fluid, and so must be our response to it. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Some had set their hearts on Italy and resented the change. Others were simply relieved to have clarity about the next steps. Most of us, I think, had already adjusted to the reality that our path would be determined by military necessity rather than personal preference. Later that evening, our room became an impromptu gathering place as cadets dropped by to discuss the news. The space filled with cigarette smoke and speculation, theories about which front offered better chances of survival, debates about different aircraft types and their relative merits. France means Sopwiths, or SE-5s, Curtis argued. Italian front would have been Capronis, or SPAD-6s. I'd rather have the British machines myself. It's not the plane that matters, Springs countered. It's the pilot. A good man in a mediocre aircraft will outlast a fool in the best machine ever built. So, which are you? Bird asked with a grin. The best of both, Springs replied without hesitation, drawing laughter from the group. As the gathering dispersed around midnight, Cal, Springs, Stokes, and I remained, sitting in comfortable silence as the last lamp burned low. Outside, a light rain began to fall, pattering against the leaded windows. Strange to think we might be split up eventually, Cal said after a while. Different squadrons, different fronts. The possibility hadn't fully registered with me until he voiced it. Since boarding the Carmania in New York, we'd moved as a unit, our 150 cadets forming a distinct American presence wherever we went. The idea of being dispersed among various squadrons, separated from the friends I'd made, created an unexpected pang of loss. Military necessity, Springs replied with a shrug. They'll put us where we're needed most. Still, Stokes said, would be nice if we could stay together. Maybe 4 of us to a flight, like we're quartered now. The idea appealed to all of us, maintaining our small fraternity within the larger military structure, facing whatever came next alongside men we'd come to trust. Whether it was possible remained to be seen, but the hope lingered as we prepared for sleep. The rain's gentle percussion, a counterpoint to our thoughts. The next morning brought unexpected news. We would be moving again, this time to Harrowby Camp at Grantham for specialized machine gun training. The transfer would happen in just 3 days, bringing our Oxford interlude to an abrupt end. Couldn't they make up their minds before we got settled? Bird complained as we packed our belongings. First Italy, then Oxford, now Grantham. Next, they'll have us guarding the Tower of London. Consider it part of our education in military efficiency, Springs suggested wryly, or rather, the lack thereof. Despite the grumbling, there was also excitement about moving closer to actual flight training. Oxford had provided essential groundwork, but none of us had joined the air service to remain earthbound. Grantham represented another step toward the cockpit, toward the sky, toward the war itself. On our last evening in Oxford, several of us made a final visit to the Canton Bar, now familiar territory after weeks of patronage. The proprietress greeted us with genuine warmth, having overcome her initial skepticism about American customers. You lads off tomorrow, then? She asked, serving our usual rounds without being asked. Grantham, isn't it? Word travels fast, Cal observed. She snorted. This is Oxford, university town. Nothing happens without everyone knowing by tea time. We settled into our usual corner, raising glasses in a toast to the city that had hosted us these past weeks. Oxford had not been our intended destination, but it had provided an unexpected respite, a pause between America and war, a space to adapt to English customs and military realities. To Oxford, Springs proposed. May we all live to see it again in peacetime. To Oxford, we echoed, glasses clinking in the warm pub light. Back in our quarters, I stood at the window for a long moment, looking out at the rain-washed quadrangle. Oxford would continue its ancient rhythms long after we departed, teaching new students, preserving knowledge, maintaining traditions. Our brief presence here was just another footnote in its centuries-long history. I turned from the window as Great Tom began to strike midnight, the bell's deep voice reverberating through stone and wood, marking the transition from one day to the next. Tomorrow would bring a new location, new challenges, new phases of our transformation from civilians to combat aviators.
Enjoying the story? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a new chapter. Episodes drop every week. Be part of the adventure. And if you're hooked, leave a like and comment your thoughts. Your support helps keep the story alive.